Hello everybody, my name is Michael Harkey. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is Testing Your SIEM. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask the question as you see it here. I will make sure it gets answered by Dan or myself. Find our tour page for upcoming webinars and workshops, and movies for most of our past webinars. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, the awareness guru of Indiana, the tamer of spreadsheets, the breaker of tech, and the man with the plan, Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Thank you very much, Mike, and welcome everybody to our webinar about how to test a SIEM. This month's shout out actually goes to Microsoft because for quite some time, well, actually since they updated PowerPoint during one of the updates that you get when you use Office 365, Microsoft has been suggesting to me that I abandon our hexagon theme that we use in our presentations. And we like this theme, by the way, because it follows the kill chain. If you were at the Cybersecurity conference in October, almost every speaker brought up the kill chain, which is a series of hexagons that show the typical breach process. But Microsoft doesn't want us to use that. They keep suggesting this approach. I call this the ink blot approach. I don't know if you've used PowerPoint since Office 365 became very proud of their themes, but every time I turn around, well, at least until I finally use this, Microsoft was suggesting we go with the ink blot theme. Now, what I don't like is the ink blot theme doesn't really lend itself very well to helping you understand what the whole agenda is because it's just one ink block. But we are going to talk about what a SIEM is. We're going to talk about testing the SIEM. And then finally, there's a bunch of things that we want to finish with to make sure you have your ducks in a row so you can get compliance credit for testing the SIEM. Now, your auditors might, have different ideas on how to test your SIEM. But what we would recommend that you at least add testing the SIEM to your audit plan so that you can have third-party and internal testing. But back to the ink blot approach, we are going to start off with defining what a SIEM actually is. But before we do, I want to back away from the trees a little bit and take a look at the whole forest. And if you haven't been paying attention, infotex for quite a while now, at least 18 months, has been projecting the notion that our clients are superheroes. You are required to do so much with so little. And so we've kind of had a couple characters come out of that, Joe ISO and Jane ISO. And both of those characters understand the basics of any kind of risk management is that you measure, you respond, and then you monitor. When we teach technology risk management, what that means is that, not only do we have to do our annual risk assessments or our drill down risk assessments or asset-based risk assessments on specific assets as we introduce them to our environment, but then a big part of that is to decide how we're going to respond to the risk that we actually measured. Are we going to mitigate it? Are we going to transfer it maybe with insurance or outsourcing it? Or are we going to accept the risk? And then finally, of course, the third process is that we need to monitor the risk, not only the risk that we accept, but also the mitigation that we have planned. Are we actually installing those new controls? Are we testing those new controls that we install to make sure they work, et cetera, et cetera? And so, and I know I'm supposed to be telling you in defining what we mean by SIEM, but before we go there, I really want to talk about why this risk monitoring process is so important. And so if you're watching this webinar because you're being required by an examiner or an auditor to install a SIEM because you want to make sure that you hit your compliance checklist, well, that is definitely a reason to monitor risk because you're being required by an auditor and examiner. But somebody snuck into my PowerPoint presentation and put the word boo after that because we think that's really a bad reason to spend that kind of money. If you're engaging with a managed security service provider to watch your network and to manage your SIEM because you're trying to check something off of a compliance risk, you're not going to get the full value of your SIEM, and I'll be talking about that in our hour today. Meanwhile, though, risk mitigation controls, we already alluded to it a little bit, but what we want you to know is we have seen this again and again, not only as auditors, but also as people helping banks and credit unions and now schools install SIEMs and manage SIEMs and develop the process that we call a SIEM. What we're here to tell you is that the team confidence increases when you monitor risk. It substantially increases for many reasons. And the primary reason is that we become aware of where our risk is. We become aware of what we're accepting. We start looking for threats exploiting a vulnerability. We have the ability to do what we call threat hunting, where we're really kind of getting out in front of the threats and trying to decide where's the next big thing going to happen and are we ready for it. And so there's a lot of good reasons, a lot of positive reasons to monitor for risk. But let me also, before I go into the definition of a SIEM, also talk about what happens when we don't monitor for risk. So, if this was the positive approach, let's take the negative approach here. Because if we're not monitoring for risk, there could be a breach on our network and we don't even know it. I mean, ultimately, what goes wrong when we don't monitor risk is that people who should not have access to information get that access, and then our reputation goes down, our likelihood goes down. We have change management issues. We could have a denial of service, not just with ransomware, but with any other kind of attack. And then, of course, for those of you who, the main reason why you're, engaging with an MSSP is to check that checklist. You're also going to have compliance deficiencies if you do not monitor for risk. So on a technical basis, from a technical perspective, what we need to monitor is not just our perimeter defenses and malware, which is one of the main reasons why you engage with a SIEM provider, a managed security service provider, what we call an MSSP, is because the main value they might offer is that they have human beings watching anything that could be wrong on your network in real time. And so they actually see the behavior of malware. It's, there's a lot of signatures used, but we're looking for the behaviors on your network traffic or in your network traffic or in your event logs that could indicate a threat exploiting a vulnerability. But beyond that, we're still also monitoring for policy enforcement. We're looking for availability issues. Insider threats are substantially reduced because of the fact that you're outsourcing to a managed security service provider, and therefore you don't have to worry about the people with the keys to the kingdom anymore. And then, of course, we're monitoring access to the system. And then finally, we're making sure that the system that's in charge of monitoring the system is a healthy system, kind of one of the meta benefits, so to speak. But if your managed security service provider is not talking to you on a regular basis about the health of the SIEM, then you don't have a healthy SIEM. And the reason why is because it's not just the managed security service provider that is involved in the SIEM. Now, I've heard and seen a lot of presentations about what a SIEM actually is. And so I'm finally to the answer to the question, what is a SIEM? And it's not really just an application or a database or a database application. I mean, those are kind of, what a SIEM is, but it's not really what we would consider a SIEM. What we think a SIEM is three teams working as one team. And really, those three teams comprise the organization's risk monitoring team, or in the case of what you're here for, what we do, the technology risk monitoring team. And so we have the internal tech people, and for the smallest of banks, this could be, your network service provider. It doesn't even have to be you, but there is an internal tech team that is involved in making sure that the antivirus systems are working, and that we've got the 5 nines in terms of internet connectivity, 99.999% uptime. They're managing the firewall. They're making changes to the system, and ultimately, the tech team is a subset of your incident response team, and so they're very involved in incident response. In many cases, they're involved in the incident response that the rest of the incident response team doesn't need to be involved in because there's no customer notification. Which brings me to the purpose of the incident response team. And the reason why we want marketing people, we want human resources people, we want executives on the incident response team is because the internal tech team can't do it all on their own. And most organizations don't want the propeller head, so to speak, in the internal tech team to be the one that decides when we notify our customers, or as of late, even the one who decides whether or not we pay a ransom if we end up with ransomware on our system. But beyond that, the incident response team is also looking for non-technical threats, exploiting vulnerabilities such as pretext calling or phishing type, things that you're not going to see readily in the network traffic or event logs. But then also policy enforcement. We want to keep an eye on that risk that we're accepting. And then, of course, the decision to notify. Which brings us to the third team that's involved in the risk monitoring team. And that's usually, if you're a larger organization, you might be building your own SIEM. You might be putting together your own security operations center. And therefore, you've got 21 shifts that you're, staffing and that sort of thing. Otherwise, you're probably outsourcing the, SIEM management and really the network monitoring process to a managed security service provider who is not only providing IPS and IDS and event log management services, but they're also handling change detection on your firewall. And they, of course, are very involved in the incident response process as well. And so to us, if you want to define a SIEM, it's really these three teams working as a team. And yes, they use tools. They use a database application. I'm going to go back to this. They use the database application to put all three teams on the same page. And that's really how we define a SIEM. It would be like saying that your forensics analyst is your right blocker. No, the right blocker is a tool that the forensics analyst uses. And likewise, the database application is a tool that your team uses, not only in the incident response process, but also in getting ready for the incident response process, which we believe is the purpose of an incident response team, is to prepare to respond to an incident, not just responding to the incident. And so ideally, your SIEM is really what the teams gather around to go through the detect and response process if necessary, to facilitate the notification process, and then again, to continually prepare for incidents. Now, having said that, due to economics, due to the fact that most internal tech teams already have a good chunk of the detection in place, antivirus systems, the unified threat management on the firewall, that sort of thing, we don't really see the SIEM completely, the response process completely organized around a SIEM yet. We believe that the future of the SIEM is going to be heading in this direction. But as it stands right now, the SIEM is involved in incident response, but we're not really using the SIEM to facilitate the notification of customers or to facilitate the training of the incident response team yet. We believe that's where the SIEM is really heading. But ultimately, if you're not big enough to be able to afford the $400,000 to $500,000 plus another $200,000 to $300,000 a year to build your own SOC, then we think maybe you'd be interested in engaging with an MSSP. You should know Infotex is an MSSP. If you don't, please know that. And know that we're one of many MSSPs. What I'm saying here today is our opinion. It might not be the opinion of our competitors. But to us, the value of engaging with an MSSP is that you have people that are in the business of 24/7 by 365 monitoring. They've got security analysts that are doing nothing but watching networks and managing that SIEM. And for our banking clients, they're connected to your network, that what we would call a persistent connection in vulnerability management. And therefore, there's some due diligence requirements that you're going to need to do on them that's a little bit above a typical vendor that only has access to the system, because even though we would only have access to your system, that persistent connection would give somebody who compromised our network access into your network, and therefore a lot of our clients would consider us a critical vendor. We do have some clients still that look at us as a high-risk vendor, and that all is dependent upon your own vendor management policy. But ultimately, MSSPs monitor, they build, they monitor, and they manage the SIEM for you in real time. There's many different quality controls that need to be in place. If you're building your own SOC, or if you're doing due diligence on a managed security service provider, you want to make sure that there's good, solid third-party assurance. Where are they getting their signatures from? We don't recommend you go with an MSSP that's still using free signatures. There are a lot of great open source places out there that are meant for internal monitoring, but if you're paying somebody, the free signatures really don't include everything that you should be looking at. But how is sensor maintenance accomplished? What kind of customization will the MSSP apply towards your unique situation? Gray matter, I'm going to talk about a little bit later. You want to look at the reporting in the dashboard. We're really big on pushing reports to our clients because we know they don't have the time and the data or a lot of times, the expertise to be able to download and understand the reports. So we'll push them out to them and interpret the reports for them in real time. And then finally, are the MSSPs you're engaged with, are they in compliance with Gramm-Leach-Bliley? Are they in the TSP examination program if you're a bank? Or do they have good third-party assurance if you're not a bank or a credit union? Really, when it comes to that compliance basic, it's not just about being in the FFIEC examination program if you're a bank, or making sure that the third-party audits are available to you if you're not a bank. And what I mean by that, by the way, is that if you're a bank or a credit union, you can order, and you should be required by your auditors and examiners to order the TSP ROE. It's called the Technology Service Provider Report of Examination. The FFIEC has identified the MSSPs working with banks and credit unions, and they have we agree to let them come in and examine us. Infotex was examined on an annual basis when we first started doing this. They then changed this to a biannual, and now we're on a every 3 years examination cycle. When they come in to examine us, beyond looking at our third-party audits, and they require us to get everything you're seeing here, but the FFIEC also looks at our financial statements. They look at the contracts we have, not only with banks, but once an examiner complained that we were giving a really good deal to a healthcare organization based here in Lafayette. Well, the guy was, one of my good friends, but they were like, "Why are you giving these guys such a good deal? You don't give banks." Well, he's my friend. But anyway, they really look under our skin. They make sure we're doing a good job for their customers, which are the banks and credit unions that they serve. But if you're a school, or if you're a hospital, or if you're an organization that does not have access to that TSP ROE, then you need to do what the FFIEC is doing when they come in to examine us. And it's not easy. They send 5 people in to do it. But you need to go over our third-party audits. You need to make sure that your SIEM provider is having pen tests and vulnerability assessments conducted against them on a regular basis. Are they engaging with a third party to conduct social engineering tests? Is someone looking at the way their network is configured? Are they doing non-technical controls reviews on a regular basis? And do they have the quality controls in place that we talked about on the previous slide? And then finally, do they have adequate insurance? All this is beyond what you might think your due diligence is, which is to read that contract. And so, know that what we're going to be talking about today is really testing the SIEM once you've already conducted the adequate vendor due diligence that needs to be conducted. One of the critical benefits of having an MSSP watch your network is what we call segregation of duties. And so whomever watches the system should not be the person who's changing the system. Otherwise, you're going to have the fox watching the hen house. And I'd like to shout out to Sophia on this. This is one of my favorite illustrations. You probably have already noticed we've got an illustrator on our staff, and she does a really good job but this exudes one of the primary values of engaging with an MSSP. But if you're engaging with an MSSP that's also handling firewall management for you, well, then that's going to end up being an audit flag somewhere down the road once the auditors and examiners realize that you've just outsourced the fox to a different fox. You still have the fox watching the hen house. So a lot of banks are starting to realize, oh my goodness, we are going to, banks get audited annually usually. And so we're going to end up, having some audit findings unless we divorce firewall management from firewall monitoring. It's because whoever changes the system should not be the one that's watching the system. And we're not just talking about protecting the overall bank here. We're talking about protecting your internal tech team. You want to make sure that you're in a position when there's a breach and the forensics start showing that, hey, it was something that happened internally. There was an insider involved. And, I haven't seen the most recent survey, but for more than 15 years now, the CSI FBI survey continually shows us that over 70% of breaches are internal. And so when there is that internal breach that's got everybody nervous, your internal tech person wants to be able to say, hey, it wasn't me, check with the MSSP. And I didn't rhyme that on purpose, but I'm eventually going to write a poem with all these rhymes that I'm coming up with. But anyway, so because of that, we need to have the SIEM architecture in place that really kind of defines, well, who's watching versus who's changing. And it's one of the problems I have, with the overall approach, mainly for economics, that most organizations are taking now, with hopefully their auditors' blessing. Maybe auditors don't really realize what they're blessing here. But ultimately, we're going to want vulnerability management information, data loss prevention, endpoint security, malware, all that firewall information. That really should be part of the SIEM. But as it stands right now, this is what the internal tech team is still handling, even though these are security functions, even though these are watcher functions and really not changer functions. And then finally, by the way, if I was an auditor and I was charged with the task of just auditing your SIEM, I'm going to want to make sure that SIEM seamlessly integrates with your ticketing system, because mitigation is an extremely important part of the SIEM process. So what's going on is we're finding out something when the SIEM, maybe the change detection, says, hey, there was a port open on your firewall and it's still open. Well, that needs to open a ticket somewhere so that somebody can go out and investigate. Why do we open the port on this firewall so we can close it? Well, do you see how there's segregation issues kind of arising here? Because if it's the same company that's saying, hey, somebody opened a port on your firewall and didn't close it, that's also supposed to be the people in charge of closing it, well, maybe there's a reason why they opened the firewall port, and it's not one that you would bless or that you would, accept or approve. I don't want to move off the slide before I point out here that we also have in this whole SIEM architecture the non-technical team, the incident response team interfaces with this as well. They are, maybe watching FSI SAC alerts, or they're interfacing into, what we're seeing coming off the SIEM, those daily reports and maybe the trend reports, and trying to look ahead to see, are we susceptible to threats that, might be on the horizon? Because especially if you're a bank or a credit union, the treasure is where your network is, right? I mean, we are starting to engage with a lot more healthcare organizations and a lot more schools who feel like, well, at least we're off their radar. I don't think that's true, but you definitely are not on the radar as much as a bank or a credit union. I will buy into that. But then finally, what we really want to stress is that when we define what a SIEM is, this architecture exists, but what's great about this architecture is that a good chunk of it is being managed in real time. It's being monitored in real time, 24/7 by 365. Or, like in the year 2020 by 366, because February 29th comes around every 4 years. So, the real big questions that we're going to have about testing the SIEM is, how do we know that the many technical parts moving together are working properly? And then finally, do we understand as an incident response team how to handle the information that we're going to receive from the SIEM when it arrives. And the answer really is a question. How do we test the SIEM? Which brings me to, where we're heading in the next section here. We need to make sure that everything's properly configured. We need to ensure that the incident response team knows what to do with that information. And then we might as well go ahead and add in the compliance targets. If you're a bank and a credit union, those are pretty well articulated for you. There's actually 75 cybersecurity assessment tool statements that touch upon what a SIEM is supposed to do. But when it comes to testing the SIEM, we really have three different areas we need to address. We got to make sure it's working, but as important as does it work and is the SIEM healthy, we also want to make sure we're prepared to use it when necessary. And then finally, are we addressing those compliance to-dos? I know I said boo on the compliance thing, and now I'm going to spend the last section, which we're not to yet. We're just getting to the second section on how to make sure you are checking things off that checklist. But know that we're starting to see our clients enlist their auditors. They're finding people in the audit firm that understand what a SIEM should do, because you're spending a lot of money on your managed security service provider. You want to make sure that all four corners of what should be happening is happening. And so the good news is that you're already performing several audit tests that I'm going to be going over here. I mean, every time you have a vulnerability assessment of your perimeter, you should be testing your SIEM. If you take the right approach towards that vulnerability assessment, you can document that you've tested that part of your SIEM, and we'll be talking about that in the third section. But let's go ahead and dive into the second section now, which is, how do we know it works? How do we know that the SIEM works? And so as an auditor, the first question I'm going to ask is it monitored 24/7, and are human beings actually sitting there watching your network, or are you relying on alerts to go to somebody's cell phone in their bedroom? Because the latter is still answers that I hear yes to, and it's wrong. It's wrong. You cannot watch a network while you're sleeping. There's, if you've got it tuned out to where you're only getting a 1 or 2 or 3 alerts during the night, then you're not properly tuning your system, A. But B, you've got a false sense of security in place. You think that all this money you're spending is going to properly monitor technology risk, and it's not. Gray matter is required 24/7, not during normal business hours. And think about it. I mean, when we're sleeping, the North Koreans are awake, right? And so we need to have gray matter watching our networks. The second question I'd ask as an auditor is, who's actually changing the firewall? Is it the same people that's watching the firewall? Because if it is, you're going to regret that, especially when one of the 70% comes up. It's an internal breach. It looks like it might have been somebody on the inside, and you can't prove it wasn't. Now, if you're outsourcing your SIEM properly, to where the people watching the firewall are not allowed to change the firewall, the people that are watching the domain, that doesn't apply just to the firewall. It also applies to every asset. The people who are watching the asset should not be allowed to change that asset. And the good news is, with the SIEM architecture that we defined before, you can at least have your AVS logs go into the SIEM. You can at least have your endpoint security logs go into the SIEM, so that the watchers are able to watch something that they're not changing. Meanwhile, one of the CAT statements, by the way, talks about asset prioritization. And when we saw that as a CAT statement, we're like, exactly, this is something we do during the tuning process. We see some organizations not doing this when we audit them, and we wonder why. We think it might be just because their SIEM provider wants to get everything. And ideally, yes, we should get everything. We should watch every single asset in your organization, not just the technology assets either. We should be watching our employees, because our employees are a huge hole into the internet, or through the internet into the network and that sort of thing. But obviously, we're not going to be able to watch everything. A SIEM can't watch your employees. They can watch the behavior of employees if your employees on the network, but there are also assets on our network that we might not be able to watch, just because we simply have this thing called economics involved in our decision-making process. And so we're going to have to prioritize assets. One of the baseline CAT statements, and by the way, for those of you who are not banks or credit unions, when I say CAT, it's short for Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. It's a guidance that was published in 2015 that really helped our company take off in terms of the number of clients we have, because it requires a lot of what we do as a managed security service provider. And so what we want you to know is that this asset prioritization is how you lay the paper trail for what you're not going to watch. And that's very important, because if there is a breach and it's through one of the assets that we're not watching, during litigation, we want to have a method to the madness when the lawyers are saying, well, why didn't you have the logs from that test server going into your SIEM? And if you have a paper trail demonstrating why, you're going to be in a much better position from a litigation perspective. And nowadays, because of the CAT, it's going to be something where you can say, hey, we did everything we were supposed to do. We prioritize the assets based on availability and based on confidentiality. And so you should be talking to your MSSP about the asset prioritization methodology. We do it in a tuning process to help our clients decide which of their devices they're going to watch. And the main reason why is for budgetary purposes. They had to cut the number of devices going into the SIEM maybe to 50 or 100 or 200, or all depending on the size of your organization and your budget, 500 or 1,000, who knows? But ultimately, you're going to have to cut it off somewhere. This is the paper trail that auditors are eventually going to want to see. Meanwhile, it's not just asset suppression, and I'm kind of, inventing that word, because we never really talked about asset suppression until, asset prioritization became a compliance issue. But we're also talking about rule suppression. So during the tuning process, we go through, all the different ways that our data security analysts can note this could be a problem on your network. And then if there's a particular rule that comes up all the time, and the client says, hey, this is our XYZ asset, it's always going to throw that rule up. It looks like this, it looks like this bad thing, but it's actually a good thing. We might decide to suppress that rule. Well, is there a paper trail of the rule suppression decisions? And then finally, do you have what we call log analysis definitions? Do you have a document that defines what logs you're looking at? And then does a decision tree on them? For this type of log, we might want to notify our client in real time. If somebody gets promoted from, just a basic user to an administrator, maybe that's something you want to call about. Maybe that's something you want, an email about. We have a document. We don't like to release it to just anybody. It's not in our boilerplate set. The main reason why is because we know that a lot of our competitors still won't define their log analysis definitions for their clients. Well, they're going to start, because auditors are going to start asking for that. They're going to start saying, hey, where's your log analysis definitions? How do I know what logs you're watching? And then what do you do with the logs once you've watched them? And by the way, how long are you saving your logs? That's the one, a lot of auditors are now, coming on to the fact that they need to ask about log retention. And so, the log analysis definitions are where we define that. You can define it in any one of your policy documents. We just define it in the log analysis definitions. But then the other thing I'm going to ask about when I audit a client is, are we aware of our coverage issues? Starting off with, are all egress points covered? We had a situation with the client many, many, many years ago, thankfully, many, many, many years ago, where, we were just trucking along, doing a really good job of watching their network, and then one of their auditors was able to just walk right in. The client originally thought they walked right in past us, but as it turned out, they walked in through an egress point that didn't have a firewall or a sensor on it. And the reason why is because the client wasn't even aware of the fact, I guess, that they needed to protect the data recovery site. And so, we didn't know that the data recovery site existed, or we would have been pounding our fist on the table saying, hey, we got to get coverage there. But, knowing your network is something we hear people say a lot. And really, when it comes to the tuning process with your MSSP, knowing your network is going to be a very important part of that process, because your MSSP does not know how many egress points you have. Meanwhile, are you aware of the blind spots? If there's a virus in one of your branches, it might be able to migrate from one workstation to the next within that branch without being detected by your your intrusion detection system, because the IDS is not getting the traffic. The traffic IDS systems are usually connected to spam ports on your switch. And so if the traffic doesn't go through a switch, you're not going to see negative traffic within that traffic. Are you aware of those blind spots? Has your MSSP documented those blind spots as part of the tuning process? Then, as an auditor, I'm going to start zooming in on the system health. I'm going to start saying, hey, you've got your asset prioritization. You've decided you want to watch the 30% most important assets. And yet I only see that you have 10% of the assets reporting in. We have clients that, are on a regular basis tapping out their asset percentage, and maybe they're buying 20 devices and they're accidentally going up to 22 as they rotate things around. We don't say anything to them because I'd rather than be at 22 when they're supposed to be watching 20. Our business is all about managing risk. Where I get worried is with the client that maybe has 100 devices that are supposed to be reporting into the SIEM, and they've only put the software on 60 of those devices, or they've only modified the configuration of 60 of those devices. So 40% of what they wanted to watch is still not being watched. As an auditor, I'm going to have that. I'm going to bring that at least to the attention of the management team, saying, hey, you're spending all this money to watch 100 devices and you're only watching 60 of them. What's going on there? But beyond that, then let's just say that you've done your job and you're supposed to be, getting 100 devices reporting into the system. Well, from time to time, that might drop down to 95. That might drop down to 90 devices because things happen. Maybe you moved the device and you forgot to, point the, where the logs from it go to, the right place or whatever. So, we want to make sure there's a process in place as an auditor to check on the health of your system. Are all devices reporting in as they're supposed to? Meanwhile, we have audited organizations where they're sending some really good, solid alert information to their clients, but they're using clear text email to send those alerts. So, kind of think this through. All right. If I'm attacking you and I'm using a man in the middle attack to get access to your network, it's kind of handy that your MSSP is sending alerts of my attack to you in clear text email, because I'm the man in the middle. I get to read everything that you're supposed to be reading. And so we need to make sure that there's a VPN really between your managed security service provider and you, or if there's not a VPN, then we should at least be using secure messaging. And I realize that getting that VPN is getting harder and harder as a lot of people start outsourcing email or start putting it in the cloud with Office 365 or whatever you're doing with that. And it's a pain in the butt to switch over to secure messaging if that's the approach we need to take. But we don't want the bad guys to be able to see what we're seeing during an attack. So I'll be looking for that when I go in and audit my clients. Are we testing each component of the SIEM to make sure that it works? That's the next thing I'm going to be looking at as an auditor. And by the way, where's your decision trees? If this happens, what's supposed to happen? And I know that's kind of confusing language, but let's just kind of bring up some real results. If we see malware on your system, if your MSSP sees malware on your system, the questions that should be readily answered is A, what's their immediate response supposed to be? B, who are they supposed to notify? And C, when? And then maybe D, what follow-up activities should occur in case the notification wasn't received. That's what we call a decision tree. You should have a decision tree for every single thing that could go wrong with your network. And then there should be one last decision tree, and that should be for unknown threats. In other words, what are we going to do if we see something that we've never anticipated? Meanwhile, who are we going to call? That's a very important part of the decision tree. We actually give it its own name, the calling tree. It can be simplified for smaller organizations, but as we get into bigger organizations, they might want us to bring human resources issues to the human resources department. I've had IT people say, hey, I don't want to know about anybody that's going to bombs.com. I just, just send that stuff directly to the HR department. We don't want the president of the bank to receive alerts about malware. It gets her way too upset. and a lot of times we have it handled before, she even logs in the morning. So, the calling tree is a very important part. We're going to take a look at that as an auditor to make sure that's in place, to make sure it makes sense, and to make sure it's kept up to date. Are the log analysis definitions confirmed? In other words, hey, if you've told your MSSP that in the event that somebody's escalated to administrator, we want to be called, we'll have you escalated somebody to an administrator to see if you get the call, right? That's one of the things we're going to want to be seeing. And so we already talked about that SIEM architecture. I can walk through that whole SIEM architecture and tell you exactly which moving parts should be tested. But the inputs to your SIEM, which, by the way, for most organizations currently, again, because of economics, are just these 4 inputs: the intrusion prevention system, the intrusion detection system, the event log management system, and then your incident response team. We eventually see antivirus. We eventually see, your endpoint security systems reporting into the SIEM. But as it stands right now, we're really looking at these 3 inputs that should be testing. But the point is that if IPS isn't working and your SIEM isn't working. Because these inputs have to be working in order for the SIEM to be working. And so, and it should be ongoing. It should be at unpredictable times. If your managed security service provider is in the kickoff meeting, which I've seen from time to time for an audit, well, they know, hey, everybody keep an eye out because the pen test is coming here soon, right? And so you really should be testing your MSSP at unpredictable times. You shouldn't be warning them, hey, we're going to be doing a pen test. That should be a surprise to them. And then they should be, there's specific behavior that they should be executing before you say, yes, it's working. And then the whole last section of this talk is about how we should be formalizing the paper trail. Now, this is something that we used to make available in our trend reports. The reason we don't anymore is because we changed the way we look at the quality control of watching the network. But a lot of our competitors still use the uncleared alerts method, and yet some of them are not sharing this with their clients. I always want to know why. Why wouldn't you share your primary quality control with your customer? We do. This isn't the exact way we report it anymore. I'll be getting to that in a minute. But since there are still, MSSPs out there using the uncleared alerts approach, this is something you don't want to see. Now, this is from 2014. I would hope this is just kind of something we did on a demo basis. I don't really remember where this screen came from, but as you can see here, this is what you really want to see. You want to see uncleared alerts kind of like stay low. But then this person went, we call it sleeping on the knock. It's a sin. If you're caught sleeping on the knock at infotex, you lost your job, okay? Because this person let the alerts build up and then cleared them all. And then let them build up and then cleared them all. And then, apparently stayed awake for a little bit and then let them build up and then cleared them all. We don't want to see this. You should see something like this in your trend reports. What infotex is currently doing is we're not watching uncleared alerts. We're watching cleared alerts. We decided to flip that around. There's a lot of reasons for that I don't want to go into. But this is what we think it would look like if someone was sleeping on a knock. Fortunately, we don't have any of these graphs available because, well, our employees love their job, and if they were caught sleeping on the knock, they'd be fired, right? But if somebody was sleeping on the knock, you would see, here they are trucking along, okay, and then all of a sudden there's nothing, and then huge, and then all of a sudden nothing, and then huge to make up for it, and it just kind of gets worse and worse. Well, we don't want to see this. We want to see nice, even coverage. As a matter of fact, this is what these graphs typically look like. Now, there's different numbers, different, customers have different number of alerts that need to be cleared. But what you want to see, this must be kind of during normal business hours. You got, 6, 7 o'clock all the way through to whatever 1600 hours is. You know what I mean? But you want to see this general, yes, we're clearing alerts all the time. It's not something where we, go get a cup of coffee and then we come back and clear a whole bunch of alerts at one time. So that's really kind of what we would be looking at as an auditor. Now, some of these tests that I'm going to be talking about coming up are tests that we also can implement as auditors, but I'm bringing these up because I feel like these are the ongoing tests that you can implement on a regular basis, assuming you know how to implement them. But the first thing that needs to be tested is the IPS system, the intrusion prevention system. The perimeter IPS, and if you have any host-based IPS, we want to make sure we're testing that as well. What intrusion prevention is it's a preventive control. It really requires detection, but it all happens in milliseconds. But we can predict certain types of negative traffic, especially on the perimeter. And if we see that traffic, we can automatically block it. A human being doesn't have to be involved in intrusion prevention systems. But when you're testing it, anytime you do a perimeter scan, it should be, it should start by whoever's executing that scan saying that he or she is being blocked, that they really can't find the vulnerabilities on your perimeter because the intrusion prevention system won't even let them see the perimeter, right? They're blocking them from access to the perimeter. And the reason why is because it's a pretty easy IPS signature to write that, hey, if you see somebody scanning us, block that IP address. And so your tester then needs to be whitelisted in order for them to continue the test. But more importantly, not more importantly, because blocking is very, very important, but as importantly, the SIEM should have reported in real time and then also in your follow-up reporting that, hey, somebody was scanning our ports and we blocked them, right? We want to make sure that we're dotting the I and crossing the T on our perimeter scans. So that's the first test that we need to conduct. The second test then is testing your intrusion detection system. And it really, starts, I feel like it's something that you can do. You don't have to wait for your auditors to test your intrusion detection system because it's usually on your internal network. You're now, if you're running a good vulnerability management program, scanning your own internal networks on a regular basis to make sure that patch management has been adequately performed, right? And so why not look at that test as also being a test to make sure your MSSP is paying attention? We have a lot of our clients who will say, hey, just suppress these. We got enough stuff going on. We don't want to hear about something we already know we're doing. Okay, and that makes sense. And I realize that, IT people are very busy people. But I think, gosh, what's it going to hurt for you to get that call? I wouldn't take it as a call. I'd take it as a real-time email, and then I want to see it in the daily report that, hey, somebody's scanning on the inside of your network. And the reason why is because it makes sure that your MSSP is executing the way they're supposed to execute. It's not just about detecting the incident. It's not just about addressing the incident. It's also about escalation. It's about reporting the incident as well. Meanwhile, your event log management system is another input that should be tested. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this on your own, starting with the fact that you should be able to test what we call rogue device detection, but, plug a new unrecognized device into your network and, you should be getting notified in real time is usually the way the decision tree is set up for that. And, you don't have to worry about being woke up in the middle of the night if you're doing it because you can plug it in during the day, right? Whenever you get a new asset, test your MSSP, plug it in without telling them about it. And they should be reporting, hey, there's a rogue device here. Is this you? Appropriate members of the group should be notified according to the calling tree. And so this is another great way to not only test the event log management system, but also it's a great way to test the calling tree to make sure that we're properly executing the calling tree. Another way to test your event log management system is to just create a test account and then give that test account administrator privileges. If everything's working right, you should be notified in real time, right? And how long is real time? That's one of the things that I like to ask when I'm an auditor. Well, how long is real time? How long did it take you? Why don't you go ahead and escalate somebody to administrator? Let's see if they call you while we're still sitting here in the interview. And then again, let's not only test the event log management system, but let's also test the decision and calling tree properly. And then, don't forget to disable the test accounts. Meanwhile, change detection is something that you're required to have now if you're a bank or credit union. I strongly encourage you to engage with us for it if you're a hospital or a school or some other organization, because if somebody opens a port on your firewall, which happens a lot more than you'd think, you want to remember to close that port when it doesn't need to be open anymore. And it is a baseline CAT statement. I think it's our number 3003 that requires this process. What all we do is we scan ports on your firewall on a periodic basis and then report to you any differences. Well, if that happens, are we following the decision tree and the calling tree properly? Testing the trees. Review that decision tree, fake an incident from your decision tree. Let's see, let's go beyond just the MSSP. Did the incident response team come together the way we're supposed to? And I know you have your formal tabletop testing if you're a bank or a credit union, and that's very, very important. I'm certainly not taking away from that. But I have a client that they actually dial into these webinars. A shout out to them. They know who they are. But they actually do a incident response tabletop test with their incident response team once every month when they have their meeting, by going through their decision tree, pulling one of the incidents out of there and say, hey, this happened, how are we going to respond? So very informal, but very powerful in terms of putting them in a place where they're confident that they can respond to incidents. And as importantly, if the incident would arise, they will be confident that they're making the right response, because they'll be able to tell each other, hey, don't forget, when we weren't in a panic, this was the same decision we made. And so testing the trees is really a good thing to do on a regular basis. Don't just wait for your annual tabletop test. If you're doing that, you're doing it to check something off a compliance list. If you're testing the trees on a regular basis, it's because you truly do want to turn a lemon into lemonade when it finally does arrive. And by the way, lemons arrive. We don't talk about if anymore, we talk about when. And we have seen organizations turn lemons into lemonade again and again and again because they had a very well prepared incident response team. The last testing category then really the best way to illustrate why do we use it as an important objective to test is best illustrated by looking at the target breach timeline. So if you probably remember this, I don't know, but malware was installed to capture credit card numbers on November 27th. FireEye, who's an MSSP, didn't notice the malware behavior until 11:30. I'm assuming that's because it's such a huge network. I don't know. To me, boy, 3 days is kind of a long time, but we work with a lot smaller organizations. FireEye is a great MSSP. I don't want to put them, I don't want to make any kind of negative light on them. But I'm assuming that the malware behavior is what they detected, because if it was known malware, then Target would have known about it too, right? Because of their antivirus systems, and then FireEye would have been able to point to the signature and say, you have this particular malware on your system. But FireEye, then started sending notices to Target that they believed the Target had malware because, again, I think they were seeing the behavior of that. And Target didn't do anything about it. We wonder, was Target in a state of disbelief, or because their antivirus system wasn't showing anything, or did they simply not have the proper escalation controls, or maybe they hadn't tested their decision tree or their calling tree and they didn't know how to escalate properly, because they're going to have to shut down some pretty important point of sale systems. But it wasn't until 2 weeks later when FireEye started saying, hey, now we're seeing exfiltration they're sending, credit card numbers and identity information out of the network that, and they actually enlisted some forensics companies to help out, to help convince Target that there really was this issue on their network. And so it wasn't until 12/15 that something was actually done about it, that the malware was removed from the network. We want early response. We don't want to wait 2 weeks when a known attack before we start doing something about it. So I'm in the interest of time, and I'm Mike and Sophia, we're going to go way over time on this. But I want to kind of go back to what I had said earlier. One of the things that we want to make sure of in terms of the whole question, does it work? We want to make sure that we're using commercial threat intelligence feeds and not the free ones. And don't get me wrong, I mean, Infotex actually founded one of the free threat intelligence feeds that ended up becoming Emerging Threats Pro. And we use the Emerging Threats Pro commercial signature set. But nowadays, if you're relying on a free feed, it's because you're not, because maybe you're a small business, you can't afford it. But it shouldn't be because you're outsourcing to an MSSP that's using a free threat intelligence feed. But back to, does it work? Are we delivering the action items that we want to see? Are we acknowledging the receipt of those action items? So that's why we think integration with the ticketing system is the way to go, is because, just because your MSSP tells you, hey, we are seeing malware on your network, doesn't mean you heard the MSSP tell you that. And so we need to have a process in place where we're acknowledging receipt of action items. And then finally, we want to make sure that the action items actually get acted upon. And so health issues, system health issues, those are action items. They're not just, we're not just talking about malware like Target went through, but we also run into a lot of times where with our busier clients where, we're noticing, issues, and those issues aren't getting addressed. It's what we call mitigation. And really, you want to have a paper trail. As an auditor, I'm going to look, what's the paper trail you have that shows that those action items are being acknowledged and then they're being addressed. And then how long does it take for us to address those action items? When I was doing research for our SIEM talk that we gave in October at the IBA, the Indiana Bankers Association's cybersecurity conference. I'm so used to saying cybersecurity assessment. But we ran across this fact from Cisco, and I was just totally blown away that 49% of legitimate alerts are not remediated. That's not a bank or a credit union. That's not an organization that's being audited, that's for sure. And so, boy, mitigation is a big part of it. Why invest all this money in an MSSP? Why invest all this money in a SIEM if you're not going to properly address the issues that are discovered by the MSSP or the SIEM? And then keep in mind, from a health perspective, every time you make a network change, you could be breaking that SIEM. You could be breaking that stream of information that's flowing into the SIEM. And so those action items related to system health are telling you, hey, you broke the SIEM again. We're not getting event logs from XYZ. And don't get me wrong, it could be something wrong on the MSSP side as well. But it's very rarely. It's not like we're changing anything, right? It's your network that's dynamic for reasons, for good reasons. But each time you make a network change, you need to make sure that you're still getting the appropriate alerts, et cetera, into your SIEM. If you got a good SIEM, the SIEM's going to let you know because it's monitoring the health of itself. And then, are you doing a good job of making sure that your tests are making it into your reporting? Are you addressing any kind of failed tests? Formalizing the tests is something that could be done by creating a test plan at the beginning of every year that says, hey, this year we're going to start testing our SIEM, we're going to test the IPS because we have auditors doing that, but we're going to start testing the decision tree and the calling tree every time we do a vulnerability scan, which we originally set up to make sure that the health of our patch management system remained high, but we now realize we can also use that as a test of our SIEM. But are we including the results of our SIEM tests in the annual information security report to the board. Which brings us to the final section of our talk here this morning. Does the testing process you have in place establish the compliance needs that it should be established? And this is where we're starting to see a lot of, unexpected benefits. We were talking about rogue technology acquisitions. When we talk about vendor management, it's something that banks and credit unions are finally getting under control. But I'll bet schools and healthcare organizations are still running into management team members bringing in new risky applications or Internet of Things, devices or whatever. But boy, when they try to attach those devices to the network and the network sends all kinds of bells and alarms off, maybe won't allow them to. Now we're getting a benefit out of the SIEM from a vendor management perspective that we weren't really, expecting when we first started looking at the SIEM. Are we monitoring our employees? One of the things that, is easy for a SIEM to do is to put a watch on assets or employees or user IDs or, however you want to put it. We are working on a webinar for the spring about employee risk assessments because we want to use the results of an employee risk assessment in our escalation process. We want to be able to watch closer those employees that represent more risk. Maybe they're a higher value target, or maybe they flunk every pretext call, who knows? But if there's an employee that's been determined to be a high risk employee, we can actually put a watch on that employee so that we're responding to any kind of issues that arise quicker. Are we identifying and fixing network addressing issues? This is something that you're gonna, if you haven't engaged with an MSSP yet, it's something you're gonna have to get through. All those network addressing issues that maybe you've done some workarounds for, or whatever, they're gonna pop back up when you're tuning out your SIEM. But we also want to make sure there's a good paper trail for your auditors. Termination processing is a really good benefit, by the way, of a SIEM, and it really helps develop that paper trail for your auditors. Your auditors are always asking, how do we know that when you terminate somebody, that particular person's being removed from the system on a timely basis? Well, if you put a watch on that particular user ID, now you've got a great report that can show exactly when that employee was disabled from the systems that are at least flowing into your SIEM. When it comes to the SIEM architecture, just to kind of help you understand, the compliance power of a SIEM, we put together this little, map. If you look here, we've numbered every single one of the statements in the cybersecurity assessment tool. Now there's actually 494 statements. So the federal government has decided there's 494 things that we can do to improve our cybersecurity posture. And these are just the statements that the SIEM actually addresses. And if you notice, most of those statements are pretty low in the numbers, following the 3 or the 2. The first number is the domain number. And so what that means is they're baseline statements. In other words, they're really basic, to-dos. There's actually over 75 cybersecurity assessment tool statements that a SIEM will address for you, or at least assist in addressing. And so we've actually, I know we've made it through to most of the talk here, and we haven't talked about what we're giving away yet, but we actually, Sophia will be sending to you 3 different giveaways. The first one being a list of those 75 statements. For those of you who are banks and credit unions, and if you've engaged with an MSSP, that becomes a really good agenda item. And maybe you just filter it down to the baseline statements, but ultimately you should be having a talk with your MSSP about all of those statements that basically is saying, what does your engagement, what does this process that we've engaged with you to handle do to address this particular statement? And then finally, if you want to test your own knowledge of SIEMs, we're also making available 2 different crossword puzzles, maybe one for your non-security technical team people, and maybe then one for your security people. Those crossword puzzles are pretty fun, and they're something that you can do to just kind of test your own knowledge of SIEM. Mike, were there any questions that came in? Apologize for going over about 10 minutes.
Oh, no, not too bad, Dan. I thought you were going to go way over. 10 minutes isn't bad at all. No questions. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And as always, you can find at Tor movies and additional webinars at tor.infotex.com. As I was saying, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And as always, I'd like to thank you, Dan, for your words of wisdom. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Sophia and everybody. Thank you all.
When you view an infotex webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what infotex presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with infotex webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but Infotex reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the webpage listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide.